Alex and SaaStock folks. Excited to be here again for round two. I was here at SaaStock Remote last year, and I'll be seeing you in person in Dublin later this year. So let's dive in. We don't have a ton of time to be able to talk about this. So we got 15 minutes to cover how to be able to nail the right SaaS budget blueprint, specifically for your marketing budget. So if you're guessing what your marketing budget ought to be, and you don't know what it should be, you're kind of falling a little bit under your pipeline targets. I'm going to help you figure that out. This is what we do all day long at Powered by Search. We work with B2B SaaS businesses that aren't growing fast enough, including some of the best in the world, like Basecamp, ClickFunnels, VMware, for example. So let's just dive in. So what is the plan for today? I want to talk a little bit about the problem, and then we're going to talk about the solution in depth. What happens if you don't get your SaaS marketing budgets right? What the alternative is if your life is figured out and you have alignment with your founding team, your CRO, your CFO, for example. What would that look like? How to use data to be able to figure out exactly what your marketing budget should be. And then 5 ways to think about marketing budget planning specifically. So this is a conversation that we see a lot of our incoming clients approach us with, which is usually the CFO or the CEO goes, what's the ROI of our marketing? And some folks on the marketing team kind of go, well, it's to increase some brand awareness and brand engagement and affinity. And the CFO goes, also, what about terms that I can understand, like EBITDA? And the person goes, you just made that up, right? That's a made up term. But we think about marketing driving the bottom line at the end of the day. Your marketing should be predictably growing your MRR, your ARR, and your annual contract values so that you can build an unstoppable B2B SaaS business. So instead of doing that, what happens if you can't get it right? You want to be able to get to the point where your pipeline targets, which are ever growing at the end of the day, are matched with your marketing budgets. So if you are in that little green circle over here where you can't hit your pipeline targets because the pipeline target grows faster than your marketing budget basically does, that's sort of problem number one to solve for. And so this is the conversation. You have last year's growth target and you have a budget, email saying, hey, I'd love to get some more budget. Maybe like 3x more would do because you've given me a 5x higher growth target from the board or from the founding team. And you end up having a conversation where it's like, no, you just have to make do with what we provided. How's 20% more basically sound? And this is a challenge that goes from, it's a trickle down effect in terms of where it starts to where it goes down to a demand gen specialist, maybe to your peer agencies that you end up working with as well. And the last part is, your marketing ends up being cost heavy. So you have an expense line that shows up and there's not much to show for it, which is usually when you don't have a marketing ROI you can connect the dots to. We want to solve that problem for sure, because if you can't say to your CFO, if we spend X, we'll get Y, this is one of the reasons that the CMO in general, that role is the shortest lived C-suite role. It's about 18 months before a new CMO basically comes in. And we've been around long enough, been doing this for 12 years now to see multiple cycles of that basically happen. So let's talk about what happens if you get this right. If you had it all figured out and the conversation changes and the email looks like this, I know exactly how much we need to be able to hit our 10x growth target happen. We will need this specific number. And the specific number is not going to be in base tense. It's not going to be, $100,000, $150,000, etc. You'll get to a number that'll be like, we need, $624,000 specifically to be able to hit the pipeline target. And so you trust a model rather than trusting your gut when you get this right. The second thing you get is what we call getting the whelm just right. Overwhelmed is when you're behind on target and you're focusing on tactical initiatives that don't drive the bottom line. Underwhelmed is when you spend a lot and you don't get the juice is not worth the squeeze, so to speak. We want to make sure you're not overwhelmed or underwhelmed. You want to get the whelm just right, where your progress to the target and the time it actually takes to be able to get there are well aligned. Not a growth curve that looks like a hockey stick, just a nice, predictable 45-degree line. And the last one, of course, is that you want to guess less and you actually want to make more. So when you get the question, how much do we need to spend on paid media to increase our SQL numbers by 15%? You just go, well, let me get back to you. Instead of that, you just go, let me check the model and what we'd need extra XYZ dollars to be able to hit those numbers. And your CFO goes, that's great. I'm just going to factor that into my projections. So now let's kind of dive into the meat and potatoes of this, which is how are you going to figure this out from a marketing budget perspective? So we're going to slow it a little bit down in terms of the formula over here. There are two drivers really to be aware of. The first driver is sort of how many clicks do you need to be able to hit your pipeline target? That's number one. Number two is what is the maximum affordability that you actually have to be able to get there? And so if you have those two things figured out, the rest becomes incredibly easy. And what you'll end up getting is essentially a max budget that you can work down from the back of it, essentially, to go, what is your optimistic, realistic, and conservative budget? There's a few drivers over here. The first driver is what we call an ARR target. You know what your ARR target basically is. That's shared in a bunch of decks. As a CEO or a founder, you know exactly what your ARR target needs to look like for the following year. You also know what your ACV, your annual contract value, is. If you are an MRR based SaaS company, multiply out by 12 and you'll get your ACV. The last thing you should also know is what your sales qualified lead to customer rate basically is. If you're a product led growth company, just replace that variable with your trial sign up to trial paid conversion rate. And the last bit over here that's important is your website conversion rate. Now, you should be able to independently go and get these numbers without really needing to dig for them, even if you don't know them like the back of your hand specifically. They're not terribly hard to find. You should be able to find each one of these numbers in your business in under an hour typically, if you know exactly where to look, if you don't already know them. So that's step number one, which is we just need to figure out what the clicks needed are to hit your pipeline target. I will walk you through a worked example of this in just a few minutes over here. Next thing to maybe think about over here is what your max cost per click is. So, what's your maximum allowable cost per click to be able to go ahead and get traffic essentially? And the gist of it is you want to figure out how many eyeballs do we need and how much are we willing to pay for those eyeballs, said in a very sort of layman's way essentially. And you want to work that backwards from the goal that you want to hit. So this is a top down marketing budget. It's a simplified back of napkin that you should be able to accomplish in under an hour really, if you were able to have some of these inputs figured out. So let's talk about the max CPC side for a second. All we're doing over here is taking your average revenue per user or customer over the course of a year, and you're dividing it by 12 to be able to understand what they pay you per month. If you already have this figured out as a plan, let's say you charge $500 per month or $9.99 per month or $14.29, or even if you charge $99 per month, you know what that number actually is. And what we're going to do here is we're going to divide it by the number 25. Jason Cohen actually had a great blog post on this many years ago about what's the maximum affordable CPC that you can actually spend over here. And this is directly linked to a driver for bootstrap companies, which is a payback period of 4 months. And so if you have funding, many of your clients do, they will typically look at a payback period that's somewhere between 12 and 18 months. But if you're bootstrap, you probably want to look at something like 4 to 6 months out. That would be your optimal target. And what that specifically means is that you're willing to commit. In this case, let's suppose you have a $500 product, 500 times 4 or $2,000 overall in customer acquisition cost. And this will all make sense as we start kind of going through a worked example. Let's dive into that. Let's suppose that you have a $1 million target in terms of added annual recurring revenue. You have a product that you sell for $25,000 in annual contract value, and you have a 25% rate of conversion from, in this case, let's suppose your sales led, from every conversation that you have as an opportunity into a closed one deal, right? You need 4 conversations effectively to close one deal. And like many B2B SaaS websites, the average conversion rate is kind of paltry at like 1%. So we're actually kind of creating a very conservative model over here. If your numbers are better, you should absolutely be putting in your numbers to figure out what your marketing budget is. Second thing we're going to do over here is going to take that same $25,000 and then divide it by 12. It comes out to about $2,000 and change per month, and divide the bottom number by 25. So far so good. Hopefully, we know our target that comes directly from up on high, or maybe from a founding conversation. You know what your average conversion contract value is. You know how many conversations it takes to be able to turn a a prospect into a customer, and you know what your average conversion rate is off your website. You should be able to get these numbers from your CRM, from your analytics suite, for example, and directly from a spreadsheet somewhere. So far, hopefully so good. Let's turn that into what that actually means. So you actually need to be able to hit $1 million at $25,000 per AR in annual contract value. You need 40 customers. Now, 40 customers, if you take four conversations, or you convert one in four conversations into customers, you're going to need to divide that by your SQL to close rate. And then we're dividing that by your web conversion rate basically as well. By the way, the best way to do this is exactly for yourselves. Do it the same way that I'm kind of walking through it over here. And each step will start making sense as you go along. So far, what we know is we need 40 customers. And we also know what our average sort of CPC is over here. So I just taken the $25,000 that you charge here and divided by 12. So you know that you have a $2,000 MRR per customer per month, and we're going to divide that by 25. Let's go one step further by doing a bit more math. This means that you need 160 sales qualified leads in this scenario, and you're going to divide that by 1%, which will give you the total number of clicks required to be able to hit your pipeline targets. Now, notice the max CPC over here is pretty high. It's $83, right? You probably aren't paying $83 on any channel right now, although you might be shying away from certain channels like LinkedIn, for example, where the cost per click can be 10 times as high as Facebook or on Google or wherever else. As an implied, if you're doing content marketing, for example, you can still get down to a CPC that's implied based off whatever you pay for your content marketing, your agency, your internal people, your sales and your marketing salaries, and then divide that by how many unit pieces of content that you have, or the traffic that that content drives. You'll basically get to an implied CPC for non-paid channels in this case, which is beyond the scope of this talk at least. So this gives us a very simple view. We need 16,000 clicks to be able to hit our target. And whether those clicks cost $1 or $83, we need to be able to multiply by what it costs to be able to get to our marketing budget, right? Now, in this case, 16,000 times 83 is a $1.3 million demand gen budget. So let's suppose you ran that by your CFO. They would come back and say, does that seem a little high to you? And you go, yeah, it does kind of seem high. That's our maximum allowable cost per click of $83. But let's actually put in our blended cost per click instead. So if we did that, and your true blended rate, let's suppose you're paying $30 on LinkedIn and $15 to $20 on Google, and you're spending $5 a click on Facebook, and maybe your content marketing clicks come in at $3 or something like that. Maybe your true blended rate is CPC of 25. So now that seems a much more palatable number. You need a $400,000 demand gen budget. Your CFO goes, that's a lot better than 1.3 million. Now, just subtle psychology over there as well. There's an anchoring principle. $400,000 seems a lot easier to sell through than the the alternative basically over here of 1.3 million. Let's talk about the ROI a little bit. So if you acquired $1 million of year one ARR for $400,000 in CAC, that's a 250% return. You're making $2.50 for every dollar you invest. And most B2B SaaS companies, unless you're heavily into enterprise, if you're SMB or mid-market focused, the average LTV is about 20 months. Okay. So you're getting about 20 months worth of payback, or rather LTV, for only investing 4 months worth of the MRR that you get paid. That's a 5-to-1 return. So now we've gone from not only knowing what the budget ought to be to what the return basically on that is as well. And I want to maybe just walk through very quickly 5 ways to think about it. One simple ballpark number is take the delta between where you're at and where you want to be in terms of ARR. Take about 40% of that, and that's going to be your marketing budget. So these are like litmus tests essentially to go through. What if you don't know what your LTV is? What if you're a young company and you just don't have enough years under your belt? Take your MRR divided by your monthly churn rate, and that'll show you what your projected LTV is for your company or your B2B SaaS. Remember that the biggest sensitivity over here is in your funnel click-through rate percentages. So improve that 1% click-through rate, or rather 1% conversion rate to 1.5, or the 25% SQL to close rate, for example, to 28%, you'll get vastly differing numbers. Don't obsess over cost per click. This is something we see too many B2B SaaS companies do. Think about cost of acquisition as opposed to cost per click specifically. And the last bit is this: to be profitable, you want to think in payback months, not the golden ratio of LTV to CAC of 3 to 1. You might have heard of that before, but really what that turns out to be is something that venture-backed companies can do. If you're bootstrapped, you want to go between somewhere between a 4 to 6 month payback period. That's a Goldilocks zone for being an unstoppable and profitable B2B SaaS company. I think that's it. I think we're probably at time over here. So would love to hear what your biggest takeaways are from this session in the networking area, so we can make room for some more amazing marketing speakers over here. Thank you.
That was amazing, Dev. Bang on time as well. Perfect, and some great reaction there from the attendees. So what a way to start this marketing filled 50 minutes that we have here. So thanks so much, Dev. Looking forward to seeing you in Dublin later this year.
Looking forward to it.